Well, thank you, Rowan, and thank you to the Turning Point Center for having me present to you. Just a little bit more on myself. I have been personally practicing yoga since 1971 as a lifestyle, and I began full-time research in yoga in 2001. So for the past 15 years, I've been doing this work. And I have two aspects to my career. One of these is actually conducting clinical trials myself directly, and the other role is more of an education policy role. I'm the editor of a yoga research journal. I work with the International Association of Yoga Therapists in the U.S., promoting the idea of research on yoga, and I spend a lot of time lecturing about the research that's going on in the field. I'm going to hopefully share some of that with you. So before we go too far into the lecture, I think the first thing we need to establish is what we're talking about when we use the word yoga. Just out of curiosity, how many people are somewhat familiar with yoga practice? Whoa, okay, so that's like 80%. I love speaking to the choir. So this is something that you're probably all familiar with, that yoga is just a four-letter word, but it's got many, many different interpretations and manifestations. So for the purpose of this talk, I'm defining yoga therapy as a multi-component practice. And this is the way that yoga was originally traditionally practiced, as a multi-component practice. And I say that because there are many people who are teaching and practicing yoga just as the physical postures and exercises, some of which you see here. And they call that yoga, and that's fine. But traditional yoga, which is the yoga that's mostly used in research and which most yoga researchers are viewing as the definition of yoga, we're looking at it is also including the breathing exercises, or so-called pranayama, also the deep relaxation techniques, and then finally the contemplative component of meditation or mindfulness practice. And many of us in the field would actually argue that this last one here is actually the most important component. In fact, an argument can be made that these physical aspects are there really to support the meditative component. So from my perspective, and those from many scholars with yoga, yoga is a contemplative practice. It's not just a form of exercise. Now, I think it's important to know just how popular yoga is becoming, because if you're a clinician, you're going to encounter this, that you're going to have a percentage of people that are familiar with yoga or open to it. This popularity is growing internationally. This is now the most popular leader of yoga, or teacher of yoga in India. This is named Swami Ramdev. He travels all over India giving yoga camps. And they have to be done in stadia or fields because these numbers are 50 to 100,000 people at a time. They do everything big in India. And they also have a satellite channel, and people in India are watching and practicing yoga in their living rooms to the TV set. So that's remarkable. Europe has a movement. This is the largest yoga center in Europe and Germany. This is a celebration of Yoga Day in Lisbon, Portugal. And, you know, there's not very many countries. In fact, there's only one country that has a real comprehensive survey of the practice of yoga in the general population, and that's the United States. So this is a survey done by a couple of yoga groups. And what they found in the survey that was just released in January of 2016 is that 36 million Americans are actively practicing yoga. That's a substantial fraction of the population. And in answer to the question, do people have some interest in practicing yoga, that was an additional 83 million. So not only is this practice popular in the U.S., that popularity seems to be growing. And this is the surveys from previous years, and you can see there's a jump from 2012 to 2016, almost 100% increase. So this is really quite a remarkable trend. This is not linear. This looks like it's exponential. So who knows where this is going to go? The Center for Disease Control in the United States, and along with the National Institutes of Health, conducts survey of complementary and integrative medicine use amongst the U.S. population, and yoga is surveyed amongst other practices. So these are the yoga statistics in these large bars here. You can see from 2002 to 2007, it went from 5 to 6% of the population, and then jumped by 50% up to almost 10% of the population, showing the same kind of trend that we see in that private survey. So really, we're talking about, 10% of the population doing anything. is a spectacular number. I mean, if we had 10% of the population with Zika virus, I mean, it would be on the news every day. But here we are with 10% of the population practicing yoga. And many people are not aware of this kind of level of practice. And it's been inspired recently by the Prime Minister of India himself, who is an avid yoga practitioner. In fact, he addressed the United Nations General Assembly in 2014 and made 3 points. One was that yoga is not just a physical practice, it's a holistic approach. Second, that this practice is very valuable in modern medicine and modern society, given the epidemic that we're experiencing in so-called lifestyle non-communicable disease. And then finally, he made a plea for adopting an International Yoga Day. And so accordingly, in December of 2014, the General Assembly of the United Nations, supported by the vote of 177 countries, established International Day of Yoga on June 21st, the summer solstice. And so here's Prime Minister Modi in June 21st of 2015, the first celebration in India. This is in downtown Delhi near the Parliament buildings. This is the well-known India Gate. He's got a few practitioners beside him, but you don't get a sense of how many until you see the aerial shot. 35,000 practitioners, and of course it's celebrated in many cities. And this was international, so we see it elsewhere. There were instances of it in the Eiffel Tower and in European countries, etc., and China as well. Anything that becomes popular in society with statistics like that, you expect to see evidence of it in the media or evidence of it in society. And certainly we see that in the United States. These are covers of well-known news magazines. This caption reads, "Dogs do it, kids do it, even desperate housewives do it." Why we've become a yoga nation. And this one here, The Science of Yoga by famous model Christy Turlington, doing a posture I don't ever plan to do. And one of the problems with this kind of media coverage is it portrays an image of yoga. And so for Americans and for many people across the world, yoga is a form of exercise that is practiced by middle-aged, thin, elegant women in leotards. And that is a problem for those of us who are trying to teach yoga to underserved populations or do yoga therapy to the elderly, etc., because then people say, well, I can't do that, so I can't do yoga. And that's a real misconception, because yoga is adaptable to virtually any population. So even a paraplegic can do slow breathing and meditation. So it is ultimately adaptable. We now in the United States have 5 airports and counting which have dedicated yoga practice rooms set aside for people to practice yoga. And Europe has now countered with 2 or 3 of their own. The advertising industry knows about yoga, and they use the positive image of yoga to sell products that have somewhat of a negative connotation. So here they're selling vodka. This is a vodka bottle doing a headstand on a yoga mat. And here they're selling an over-the-counter sleeping pill with a yoga posture, suggesting that if you take their sleeping pill, you'll get a good night's sleep, be more refreshed, and more willing to do your yoga in the morning. Somewhat backwards, I think. And a big corporation like McDonald's has jumped on as well. This was a promotion they had a few years ago in the US with a yoga DVD. And I walked into a rest stop on the highway, and there in my fruit and yogurt cup was an unmistakable practitioner of yoga. And this is a full-page ad in one of our news magazines, and the caption here reads, "I do yoga in my suite, doctor's orders." And this suggests this construct that people are using yoga not just for sort of health and wellness, but they're using it to treat medical conditions. Now, yoga historically was never really a systematized form of medicine. That's not what it was. It was a practice for personal development, spiritual growth, and enhancement. However, the fact that yoga is working on multiple levels of psychology and physiology, and perhaps even pathology, suggests that it may help people with disease states to reduce the severity of their symptoms, or in some cases maybe even to cure the disorder. And so consequently, you see in the beginning of the 20th century, it started to be applied in India as a therapy. And then it became very popular. There was clinics, there was hospitals where yoga therapy was being administered. And in 1963, the Indian government commissioned this book called Yogic Therapy. And that popularity has continued to grow. It's come to the West, just like yoga has. And now there's this book called Yoga as Medicine. And now there's many books, not just on yoga as therapy in general, But you can now buy books on yoga for specific disorders, yoga for insomnia, yoga for depression, et cetera, et cetera. So it is really growing in popularity. And that is showing with evidence in the media as well. So here's another cover of Time magazine, How Your Mind Can Heal Your Body, with an unmistakable yoga image. In the United States, we have the International Association of Yoga Therapists, which is 4,000 members strong. These are all people who are not only yoga instructors, but have gone on to do significant additional medical type training so that they are qualified and capable of appropriately applying yoga to patient populations, so-called yoga therapy. And this organization is probably the most active yoga organization in the West, promoting the implementation of yoga therapy into modern medicine, and they're doing self-credentialing to make sure that what they are doing with patient populations is safe and even effective. You have something similar here as well. This is the Australasian Association of Yoga Therapists, in fact, there's actually a study that was done that sort of hints on perhaps some of the prevalence of yoga therapy here. This was published a few years ago, and what they did was a survey of New South Wales rural general practitioners and asked them, how often do you refer for yoga therapy? And so in these three categories, at least weekly, at least monthly, and a few times per year, if you add the percentages up from these three, that's 76% of them, suggesting that yoga therapy is somewhat well known here as well. But we really need some surveys to really demonstrate that. So I want to focus now on the psychophysiology of yoga. We now have a number of studies that are telling us exactly how yoga is working on psychological and physiological mechanisms. And this is really informative information because it takes us out of the realm of this being a hobby or placebo effect or expectation effects. And a lot of this work is summarized in these books here, which are actually targeted at the general public, which I've been involved in. And ordinarily, I would not want to do a book for the general public because that's not my job. My job is to publish in peer-reviewed journals. But I could not turn down the opportunity from Harvard Health Publications, who invited me to participate in these and to have books out there with the Harvard Medical School logo, their name, and the word yoga on the same cover. Now, this in itself is kind of remarkable because to think 20 years ago, this would have been inconceivable to even think that this could happen. So yoga is actually gaining ground in academia as well. The body of literature has grown to the point where, as in any field of science, you have review papers because there's enough literature to actually review mechanisms. So there's 3 papers here. One is on yogic mechanisms and how they reduce stress, neurophysiological and neurocognitive mechanisms, and self-regulatory mechanisms with respect to how yoga is working. But let me take you back historically a little bit where this started. There were claims in the media that showed up in the West, and this dates back all the way to the 1800s, where travelers were talking about these yogis or fakirs who were doing these fantastic feats with their body. They'd be buried in a pit underground for weeks at a time. They claimed that they could stop their heartbeats. They claimed that they could withstand pain. They claimed that they were achieving these altered states of consciousness. So this drew the attentions of some Western scientists to evaluate whether indeed these people could actually do something that was novel, that might inform the field of physiology or psychology. And one of these studies, probably the most comprehensive one, was conducted by 2 Indian scientists who had faculty positions at UCLA and the University of Michigan. And they took this portable electrophysiological recording equipment you see here in the photo, and they traveled all over India for a full year, hunting down all of these yoga masters, wherever they were, and then wiring them up, and then seeing what happened during their practices. And the central conclusion from this study was that physiologically, yogic meditation represents deep relaxation of the autonomic nervous system, which introduces one of the central constructs of how yoga works, and that is that it creates the ability to self-regulate internal state, both physiological and psychological. Now, the autonomic nervous system was called autonomic because it was believed to be automatic, that you had no control over that system, and indeed for most people that's the case. However, these individuals could control sympathetic activity, parasympathetic activity, the expression of noradrenaline and adrenaline, which are involved in the autonomic nervous system, But it's gone beyond that. It's gone into the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis as well, whose output is the stress hormone cortisol. So one of the big areas that this self-regulation takes place in is the self-regulation of the stress response systems and the limbic system, the emotion system. So yoga has this capability of allowing its practitioners to exert some degree of control over stress responsivity and emotional reactivity. And that is a fundamental finding that many papers that measure those kinds of outcomes will definitely show. Perhaps the most stunning example of this is an anecdote. And I apologize, this is an anecdote, but it's one that I like to highlight. This is a yoga master named Swami Rama who came to the United States to teach yoga. And they took him to the Menninger Clinic and hooked him up. And just sitting in a chair, they had, in this experiment here, they were looking at skin temperature on both sides of the same hand. And just by sitting there without any overt activity, he was able to increase the skin temperature on one side while simultaneously decreasing the skin temperature on the other side of the same hand. Now what he's doing here is he's controlling blood flow to the skin. When you vasodilate blood vessels to the skin gets colder. When it gets warmer because there's more blood flow. When you vasoconstrict blood vessels, the skin gets colder because there's less blood flow. So he was able to control not just autonomic function, but he could distinguish between the autonomic nerves that innervate one side of the hand as opposed to the other side of the hand. All right? Now, this really highlights this sort of unknown ability in modern medicine, certainly, that humans have an enormous capability for self-regulation of internal state. And this is lost in modern medicine, except for fields like biofeedback and mind-body medicine. But it really highlights the fact that humans have a lot of capability if they want to learn to exert that. Herbert Benson is probably one of the longest-lived meditation researchers. In the late 60s and early 70s, he worked with transcendental meditators and showed that another internal function, and in this case oxygen consumption or metabolic rate, was actually reduced during meditation. So here's a willful activity that humans could do that could regulate another phenomenon in physiology that was believed to be outside of our control. Now, there's other aspects of yoga, the breathing techniques. One of the classic breathing techniques in yoga, and the one that's most commonly used, is long, slow breathing. This is actually a technique that's been used by many psychologists for decades, but long, slow breathing has very profound effects on psychophysiology. One effect is that it's a much more efficient breathing pattern. You ventilate and exchange oxygen and carbon dioxide much more efficiently when you do long, slow breathing than when you do typical breathing of what we see in society. And that manifests in plasticity changes within the respiratory system over time. So in this study by Luciano Bernardi in Italy, who is one of the leaders in the field of research in this area, he showed that people who are yoga practitioners maintain oxygen saturation levels equivalent to Sherpas at high altitude, showing that this kind of breathing is highly effective for maintaining gas exchange. Another phenomenon with long, slow breathing is that when you breathe long and slow through the baroreceptor reflex, you have direct access to the autonomic nervous system. And so this is used in mind-body medicine as a strategy to reduce sympathetic drive. When you slow your breathing down, sympathetic drive tends to go down. So this is used in concert with the other practices to generate this relaxation effect. And of course, there are the physical practices. I mean, these are the most obvious. When you stretch, you become more limber. When you hold isometric postures, you become stronger. And so in this study, they did that. They took naive practitioners, gave them a yoga intervention over time, and improved flexibility, muscular endurance, and muscular strength. So clearly that's a physical component that is achieving benefit. So now I want to switch to sort of the two cutting-edge areas of research, not only in yoga research, but also in mind-body medicine. And one of these involves molecular biological evaluations. So this is the central dogma or central theorem of biology, that DNA, our genes, produce RNA, which ultimately produce proteins, which do all of the actions that we need in the body. And of course, what we know now is that there is control that you can exert at all levels of this cascade from genes to proteins. In fact, you can directly affect gene expression. And we know that this is obvious from environmental or internal changes. We know that if you smoke cigarettes, you're more likely to turn on genes that are going to generate a tumor. By the same token, if you do healthy activities, you're going to turn on genes that are beneficial. And so now this has been applied to these mind-body strategies, including yoga and meditation. So this is a study out of UCLA, and this study looked at a yoga meditation in chronically stressed caregivers of dementia patients. These people are under high levels of chronic stress. And what they found when they looked at genomic expression is that the practice suppressed expression of inflammation-related genes and upregulated expression of genes involved in antiviral and immunoglobulin responses. Now, this is actually consistent with what we see behaviorally. We see that inflammation is reduced. We see that immune function is improved. We see a number of other things, that stress responsivity, stress hormone levels are reduced. And so we can see this now by looking at genomic expression outcomes, which is a very powerful objective measure. And so the future of this is very bright, because now we can take a type 2 diabetic and we can give them a yoga intervention. And then we can see that indeed the genes that are involved in insulin and glucose regulation are modified. So it's an objective measure that's very powerful and very convincing. And another molecule that's been looked at and been implicated in stress is telomerase. The telomeres are the ends of the chromosomes. And it's now known that under chronic stress, these telomeres degrade. And that's a bad thing. You don't want your DNA degrading. In any case, DNA degrades like that with age as well. So this is the same group that did this study, and notably this is Elizabeth Blackburn, the Nobel Prize winner, that's involved in this determination of the role of the telomeres and telomerase. And what they found was that in response to this yogic meditation, in a randomized controlled trial, comparing this meditation with the simple relaxation technique, they were able to increase the levels of telomerase, whereas the control group was not able to do that. And telomerase acts to restore the telomeres, restore the ends of the telomeres. So we're seeing these changes manifesting in positive ways at the cellular and molecular level in the body. Now, the other cutting-edge area of research in contemplative practices, mind-body medicine, is so-called neuroimaging techniques. And these are these large machines that are able to peer into the brain to look at from second to second changes and very discrete and precise localization of where activity changes are taking place in the brain. One of the most common techniques is the fMRI, and this is Richie Davidson, who is a leader in the field of meditation research. This has now become a real industry in terms of documenting what's happening with these practices. So one kind of practice is to take long-term meditators and compare them with non-meditators in the scanner and see if their brain activity patterns are any different. So for example, in this study here, they found that indeed there are differences between them, and the observed changes appear in structures that underlie the attention network and those that relate to emotion and autonomic function. So once again, we're seeing that the objective changes we're seeing with these techniques are verifying the behavioral changes that we see. The attention network, because meditation is nothing more than the act of controlling your attention, focusing your attention on some kind of target in a non-analytical manner. And we know about the self-regulation of emotion and stress. So what we're seeing in the scanner is basically verifying what we're seeing behaviorally. Now, another measure that we can use, this is actually spectroscopy. And this spectroscopic technique can actually look at a single molecule and its expression within the brain. And in this case, the molecule we're looking at is GABA, a well-known inhibitory neurotransmitter throughout the central nervous system. And GABA has been associated with mood state. So in this study, they did a scan before and after a single yoga class. And what they found was that the levels of GABA from pre to post were increased. And so higher levels of GABA are associated with positive mood, and in this study they were also associated with mood improvements after the yoga class. So we're now able to see biochemical changes within the central nervous system in response to these practices. Now, the brain exhibits plasticity. And that plasticity leads to structural changes in the brain. So one of the classic examples is the London taxi driver. In the London taxi driver's brain, there's a map of London. Now that map of London takes some real estate in the brain. There's a lot of neural connections, there's a lot of blood flow there, there's glial cell support. That area of the brain that houses that information on the London map is taking up more volume, more structure. And that's how the brain is plastic. The brain adjusts to your activities. So the same could be argued would be the case for meditation and yoga practices. So this is a study conducted by a researcher at our National Institutes of Health, and she looked at long-term yoga practitioners and compared them to non-yoga practitioners. And one of the measures she looked at was cold pain tolerance. So here you see the filled dots are the long-term yoga practitioners, the open dots are the normal. So yoga practitioners have higher pain tolerance. They also measured that area of the brain that's responsible for pain regulation and showed that the gray matter volume is actually larger in long-term yoga practitioners than in non-practitioners. So not only is there a behavioral advantage, you can see the structural change in the brain in long-term practitioners as well. And that structural change is practice related. In other words, the duration of yoga practice predicts the increase in volume in that region of the brain. So as you practice these techniques over time, you not only improve your activity with respect to positive outcomes, you're actually changing structure in the brain to accommodate the long-term efficacy of those practices. Another example of this is another phenomenon around fluid intelligence, a high-level executive activity in the brain. This is what makes us human, the ability to think abstractly, reason, identify patterns, solve problems, and discern relationships. And what we know about fluid intelligence is that it declines with age, like almost everything. And so this is the decline over age in the normal population. And what they did in this study was they compared the normals with long-term yoga practitioners and long-term meditators. And in the dotted lines, the dashed lines, you can see that is the decline with them. And so you can see there's a marked difference between those two curves, suggesting that there's some kind of anti-aging phenomenon that maintains fluid intelligence. And of course, if you're maintaining fluid intelligence, it's likely that you're really maintaining functional architecture in the brain, maintaining the connections that are responsible for this high-level activity. So that is now taking us into the realm of objective measures, that this is not just perception, it's not just belief, it's actually biological changes that are taking place in the brain and the body. Now, as I mentioned, meditation is the simple focus of attention. Now, when you focus your attention in the act of meditation, mind wandering kind of stops because now you're focusing your attention. Now, the act of meditation is actually a circular process. You focus your attention, and invariably, depending upon the state you're in or who you are, 10, 15, 20 seconds later, you'll notice that you have gone off target and your mind is wandering. And then you say, oh, I'm supposed to be focusing, and then you bring your focus back. That cycle just repeats and repeats and repeats. That's what meditation is. It is that cycle. Nobody goes into this trance state for an hour and then comes out. That's a myth. Everybody has mind-wandering intrusions. But the more time you spend focusing, the more you're training the mind, you're engaging the attention networks in the brain to keep focused. So scientists have been studying what the consequences are of that meditative focus, but then they're also asking, well, what is this mind-wandering thing? Why are we mind-wandering? And so nonetheless, then a Harvard team publishing in our premier biomedical journal Science studied mind-wandering. And they studied this in the general population. And what they found was that people's minds wandered frequently regardless of what they were doing. Well, that's been known for centuries, for millennia, that's a characteristic of the mind, that the mind wanders. But here's the interesting finding in the study. People were less happy when their minds were wandering than when they were not. So that's interesting. Why would you be less happy if you allow your mind to wander? Well, if you think about it, this is this fluid intelligence. We have this human capability that animals don't have to analyze the past, predict the future. And a lot of mind wandering is targeted at our needs. So, of course, a good substantial portion of that is sex, but we're not going to talk about that here. But another important aspect of mind wandering is really focused on survival. So in a lot of this mind wandering, we are really looking at our survival, the past, the future, the present, and making predictions. So let me give you a made-up example. You're standing at the bus stop, ready to go to work in the morning. It starts to drizzle or rain. You say, geez, the bus might be late. I don't see any taxi cabs around. Gee, it's too far to walk. Oh my God, if I'm late for work, my boss is going to chew me out because I was late for work last week. If I'm late twice, my boss might fire me. If my boss fires me, my wife is going to kill me. And you know the drill. It just keeps going on and on and on. And that's the way mind wandering goes. Now, if you think about it, those kind of survival thoughts, they're not terribly uplifting. And most of the content of mind wandering is that kind of sort of emotional or stress challenge. So as you're dealing with this and you're allowing the mind to wander 24/7, 365 days of the year, what's happening? Well, each one of those little thoughts is generating a stress or emotion response, and so you're feeding that part of your limbic system that responds to that stuff, and you're constantly in that negative mind. And of course, there's a lot of stuff in modern society that generates a lot of negative survival mentation. So what do you do when you meditate? Well, you stop mind wandering by focusing your attention on a target. So essentially, that's a mind wandering holiday. You get away from that. And so the more time you spend in that neutral space when the mind is not wandering and gain more control of not allowing yourself to mind wander, the more do you develop that skill. And in fact, what we're finding now is that long-term meditators structurally have a smaller limbic system. The amygdala is actually smaller because they're activating it less. And long-term use of your mind wandering is starting to be shown that mind wandering turns into rumination. Rumination turns into risk factors for mood disturbance, and risk factors for mood disturbance turn into depression, anxiety, and other psychological conditions. So this is, now we're starting to look at behaviorally what the consequences are of allowing the mind to wander and what the consequences are of practicing these contemplative practices. This study kind of put it together. This was an fMRI study looking at meditators in the scanner, and the instruction was that when you first notice that your mind is wandering in the act of meditation, press the event marker. So now they had scans of the brain in the different phases of the meditation practice. So here in the focus phase, when they're actively holding their attention, it's the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that's activated. This is your executive brain, the frontal lobe, the area where the attention networks are. So that behaviorally makes sense. When the mind was wandering, there's another set of regions, diffuse set of brain regions that are activated, and these have been called the default mode network. So it's very clear, when you're meditating, you're in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. When you're not, you're in the default mode network. And so we can actually see what the consequences are of continuous default mode network activity versus dorsolateral prefrontal cortex activity. And this manifests in these behavioral advantages that we see with meditation and yoga practices. So one thing that I keep coming back to is stress. And I would say that the ability to manage stress and emotion is probably center of mass for most of the yoga and meditation intervention studies. Any of those studies that have ever even used those outcomes to evaluate it usually shows improvements. And in fact, it's a major reason why people practice yoga. So this is a survey study we published out of Austin, Texas, where we looked at beginners yoga students who were taking a beginners yoga program. And we asked them, okay, why are you here? What's your reason for doing this yoga program? And they were allowed to answer to multiple items. And the top three were general wellness, physical exercise, and stress management. It is one of the major reasons why people come to yoga practice. And in fact, there was a survey study done here on yoga practitioners in Australia, and it's almost identical to the results that we had. So the top three here are increase in health and fitness, increased flexibility and muscle tone, and there it is, reduced stress or anxiety. In beginning students, 58%, and continuing students, 80%. So it's the same across the globe. People are coming to yoga practice because it's a stress management strategy. And the reason that that's happening is because our society has no other stress management strategies. It's not taught in our public schools. In fact, the teachers are stressed and burned out. It's not taught in our medical clinics because the doctors themselves are stressed and burned out. So it's not a strategy that we have as a modern society. But it is a strategy that can be effective in helping people cope with stress. So there have been some reviews of this, and indeed they show that yoga appears to be a promising modality for stress management, looking at the number of publications that have been done and the outcomes. In our own work, we've seen this. So this is a study by a colleague in Wales in the UK, and this is in a workplace population. You know, kind of ironically, it's in a National Health Service clinical population. These are clerical workers who were given in a randomized controlled trial format an 8-week yoga intervention and compared with those that didn't participate. And not surprisingly, in measuring the perceived stress scale, the control practitioners had no change, whereas the yoga group showed a significant decline and therefore improvement. Now, another component of yoga practice is a little bit more subtle, and there's a lot less research in this vein, but it's relevant to addiction and addictive behaviors. And that is yoga as a transformative practice. I think there's a temporal thing that happens with yoga. Now, over the short term, you practice over a few minutes, over the course of a single yoga class, certainly. You see a psychophysiological reduction in arousal. You're reducing sympathetic drive, enhancing parasympathetic activity, reducing norepinephrine levels, reducing cortisol levels. Herbert Benson coined this as the relaxation response. And he coined that phrase because it's the exact opposite of the stress response or the fight or flight response in terms of its effects on the body. And so this generates this sense of physical and mental well-being and arousal reduction. And this is why people come to yoga class. They have a hard day at work, they go to yoga class, they chill out, and they have a nice evening. So that's the short term. Now, as people practice regularly over the course of weeks and months, plasticity and practice take hold. And they become more aware because they're engaging the attention networks. They become more sensitive of their internal state, their environment, and they also self-regulate. And that self-regulation applies and generates this state we call resilience, the ability to tolerate and react to stress more effectively. And the same applies with emotion. So these are now skills. And this is one of the major things we see in yoga research, and that's really important in patient populations, because now they have some ability to self-regulate. And stress is a huge contributor to virtually every disease known. In diseases that you might not think stress is important, such as type 2 diabetes, stress plays a significant role, not just in terms of behavior, but also in terms of mechanism. Cortisol at high chronic levels is actually neurotoxic and interacts negatively with a lot of physiological systems. Now, here's the phenomenon that I'm talking about in this slide, and that is that over weeks and months, many people will experience an actual transformative change. It's a psychological and philosophical transformation. And people will say things like, yoga changed my life. And, you know, you ask yourself, well, what do they mean yoga changed my life? I didn't grow a second head or a second arm. What do you mean yoga changed your life? And what they're talking about is a change in identity and in perspective. It's a change in attitude. And it's one that's very positive. It's one that is a change in a positive direction. So they might have materialistic life goals. They switch from those, which we know are not satisfying over the long term. They switch to more positive and deeper goals of, say, self-improvement. And what this comes from, I believe, is that people will experience a unitive state, a deep, profound experience of peace and harmony. It might only last a half a second in a meditation practice, but it is so profound and so revealing that it is actually life-changing. And then people will actually change their values, their directions, their goals. They'll change their job. They may even change their spouse. And it's all in a positive direction towards deeper goals within life. And this can be really, really powerful, especially for people who are really desperate and need support for a lifestyle change from the bottom up. And so this is not an insignificant thing, but there's very little research on this, and I'll show you just a few hints of this. This is actually Richie Davidson's work way back from the 1970s. And what they did was they compared control subjects with beginner meditators, short-term meditators, and long-term meditators, and they looked at this outcome measure called absorption. And what they found was that it was a dose-response relationship. So people that didn't practice were down here, low practitioners, middle practitioners, long practitioners. There was a dose-response curve to this absorptive, unitive state experience. Another example is this study that was done in a yoga community, a yoga ashram, where people are practicing yoga on a very intensive basis in a group community living center. And they compared these with non-ashram residents. And they asked questions like that reflected these deeper states. And then they asked them to sort of, what percentage of them really had experience of these types of changes. So for example, here, became aware of a new reality. That's 90% of the ashram residents, only 70% of the normals. Felt a personality change, 90% versus 50%. Experience resulted in change in life, 87% versus 64%. And now we go deeper into this unitive state. Experience of oneness, 83% versus 40%. And then in touch with the divine or spiritual, 91% versus 43%. So there is some long-term benefit, and I believe what's happening here is that there is a part in the brain that's been identified in other research studies that's responsible for this deep, unitive, profound experience. And we know this because hallucinogens like psilocybin or LSD can accidentally trigger that area of the brain, so people can actually have that unitive experience. So we know that this is something that can be triggered and manifested or enhanced with yoga practice. Now, most of these studies are retrospective, as is this one here that we conducted in long-term yoga practitioners. We correlated their experiences of transcendence with how much time and how many years they've been practicing yoga. And it's clear that these changes are statistically significant. So the more they practice, the more they have this transcendent type experience. Now, these are retrospective, but we applied this in a prospective manner with a population of elite young musicians. And musicians in their music practice often experience this state of merger. And what we found was that we could increase the total mindfulness they were experiencing and subscales of the mindfulness questionnaire, including observing and awareness, whereas controls were actually getting worse in this study. And there's another construct which is related to this called flow. Flow is this sense of an immersion in an activity. It's a very powerful and beautiful experience where there's a sense of timelessness, a sense of unity, non-duality. And musicians often experience this in their music practice. We were able to enhance this with 6 weeks of yoga. So the musicians that got yoga had more flow, the controls had no change, and a subscale of this questionnaire is the autotelic experience, which is the actual unitive experience itself. And that was also greater in the yoga group. So we believe that we can actually enhance the quantity and depth of these kinds of experiences over time. In fact, there's even a study now which is in press that was published here by Mark Cohen at RMIT, and they looked at flow in a population, in 3 populations, in yoga practitioners, non-yoga practitioners, and people with metabolic syndrome. All 3 populations were able to show increases in that flow construct. So this is a logic model that summarizes all of the psychophysiology I've described to you so far. So it's a multi-component practice, and it's largely through the physical components that you're increasing fitness components, flexibility, strength, coordination, balance, respiratory function, and that leads to a physical self-efficacy. And then it's largely through all of these practices that you increase self-regulation. We've talked about emotion regulation, stress regulation, which leads to these states of resilience to stress and equanimity in the face of strong emotion. And that leads to a psychological self-efficacy. It's the meditative, contemplative component when you focus your attention that you're enhancing mind-body awareness. That's by engaging the attention networks, increasing mindfulness, increasing cognitive function like concentration, and developing metacognition, the ability to stand back from your thoughts and have some degree of control over that process. And that's an important feature not just in meditation, but of course also in cognitive behavioral therapy. And then finally, the evidence is weakest for this component here, which I'm calling spirituality, these transcendent states, the unitive state, the flow experience, which leads to a transformation and in many people a change in life meaning and purpose. So all of these boxes are not separate. Of course, everything's interconnected in the mind-body continuum. But because you're working on many levels, you have global changes over the whole system. That includes the mundane, which is physical and mental health, physical, mental, and emotional performance, and then higher level changes like social responsibility, values, relationships, and then the deeper stuff, quality of life, life purpose and meaning, and even spirituality. So it is a global practice that can have effects on global levels of functioning. So I'm just going to go very quickly through yoga therapy research. This field is growing rapidly. The evidence that yoga can work on specific disorders. This is the entire body of literature. There's only 450 studies, but look what's happened over the past 10 years. And these are the randomized controlled trials suggesting that the quality of these studies is also improving. This paper was just published last year. We now have a symposium on yoga research, which has had its 6th iteration in the United States. This is an academic conference to move yoga research forward. It's also, then there's enough body of literature now that we have published this book of the first of its kind. It's a medical textbook, The Principles and Practice of Yoga in Healthcare, with 60 yoga researchers contributing 23 chapters which review the scientific rationale, the research evidence, and the practice recommendations. So this is our now face of yoga into modern medicine. This is written by medical professionals for medical professionals. And it really is summarizing all of the literature in a readable and credible fashion. So we're moving this into professional society. Just a couple of examples of things that have been done, some from my lab. This is a study on chronic insomnia comparing a sleep hygiene intervention with yoga, and the yoga showed improvements generally in sleep onset latency, total wake time decreasing over the 8-week intervention, sleep efficiency increasing, and total sleep time increasing over the course of the intervention. And this is the kind of change you expect to see with a mind-body intervention. It's usually gradual. It's not the fantastic experience you expect with the pill. This is something that takes time to make a change, but this change is somewhat permanent because these people are learning a skill, and that skill is with them forever. We've also looked at generalized anxiety disorder. This was a small trial that compared yoga together with CBT, showing improvements in state and trait anxiety, but also in panic, depression, and sleep disturbance. And this pilot data was used for a grant application, which we are now 3 or 4 years into. This is a multi-site trial of yoga for generalized anxiety disorder in Massachusetts. We've also done some studies with post-traumatic stress disorder, a well-known mind-body disorder, and a disorder which is probably not uncommon in the field of substance abuse as a reason for substance use. And what we were able to show was reductions in PTSD symptoms over the course of the treatment. Control group, the randomized control trial, showing no difference. And these are the things that we expect to see, as I've described: increases in resilience, reductions in perceived stress, and another measure of stress.
What was the control?
The control was just, I think in this study, was no treatment. And many of the yoga studies, the control is a weak no treatment control. We are trying to move in the field to active treatment controls to really control for a lot of the active components of yoga practice. But this is an infant field, and as we grow and try and get funding and try and expand the studies, we're going to move in that direction of stronger research designs. So what is the rationale for addictive behavior? If you looked at that logic model, I'm sure those of you involved in substance abuse research are probably familiar with how this is relevant. And there's a couple of papers here that have looked at examples of this. This can be involved in terms of trigger events and how the time, there's the periods of unconscious awareness which yoga can enhance and allow people to exert a choice in terms of responding to high-risk situations that may trigger a relapse of substance use. This is a further model from the same paper. You're looking at the high-risk situation can go in 2 ways: the path towards recovery, which is an effective coping response leading to decreased probability of relapse, and then the other way of an ineffective coping response. If you're not coping with stress properly, one of the dysfunctional responses to stress is substance use. So that takes you down to the path of increased probability of relapse. Another model from another paper talking about mindfulness training, and again, a lot of these things are listed in that logic model. What we're talking about is increased awareness, decreased autopilot, and it intervenes in a lot of these things that are known to generate substance abuse behavior: lack of awareness, autopilot, judgmentalism, craving, negative affect, and stress reactivity, which all contribute to the initiation and maintenance of substance use. So these are in word form, the rationale for how yoga works: the stress arousal reduction and increased resilience, increase in mind-body awareness, increase in self-regulation, self-efficacy and empowerment, improvement in mood and psychological well-being, induction of contemplative states and peak experiences. So in some sense, these experiences can replace the high of substances. So in a sense, it can be a substitution, a healthy one, the one that is done through self-regulation practices. And then this deeper worldview transformation, which can be really transformative in changing people's attitudes and goals in life, which can be really, really powerful in helping people achieve a successful lifestyle change. So just a few examples here, and I'm not going to have time to go through all of these in detail, but these are examples from qualitative studies of patients who have reported these kinds of changes. So stress arousal reduction and increased resilience. When I relax, it takes my mind off things, using anchor, breathing in, breathing out, clearing your mind. That part makes me relax, calm. I came in angry, have something on my mind. After that meditation, it's like I'm in the room. I don't have nothing else in my mind but in the room. So they're coming into the present moment. They're getting away from negative rumination. Increase in mind-body awareness. Closing my eyes when we first started and doing the in and out breath, it relaxed me and got me set up for therapy. When I first felt it, it hit my nose. It was exciting. I felt the air. Here's this increase in mind-body awareness. They're starting to become aware of their interoception, their internal body states. First becoming aware of these changes and all these different techniques to help me put these changes into effect. That awareness is the first step towards improved self-regulation. And here's the self-regulation, self-efficacy. I made a change. I started caring about myself. I didn't want to die. I was on the road to kill myself. So yeah, there was a shift in my thoughts. Instead of cursing, I talk. My actions, my behaviors, my speech changed. I was changing before, but this helped even more. I don't abuse pills anymore. It helped me calm myself down. I think before I react. There's the metacognition encapsulated in that comment. Improvement in mood and psychological well-being. I was looking for help because they were giving me medication for depression and it wasn't helping. And it's weird because something as simple as breathing in and out, it helps a lot. It does help. And then finally, the one we have probably the least evidence of is this contemplative state. Yes, probably about the third week. It was a feeling of enjoyment or self-fulfillment. There's this sense of a deeper experience with this long-term practice that can support behavior change. And then the worldview transformation. I'm learning new techniques like meditation. It helped me look at life and myself in a better way. And this one here, because I'm a very self-centered person, a very selfish person, and being in the study, I learned the world don't revolve around me. There's other people in this world. And I started thinking about her feelings. He's talking about his partner. So this can make real shifts in people's worldview and behavior. So very quickly, there is some research trials on this. This is a review that looked at 24 studies looking at the evidence of mindfulness-based interventions on substance abuse, suggesting that mindfulness-based interventions are associated with reduction in craving as well as increased mindfulness. This review of meditation, yoga, and mindfulness studies suggesting that there is also efficacy from yoga studies as well. And just a few examples of yoga studies. This is a yogic breathing intervention for cigarette craving, showing reductions compared to a control group. This study on smoking behavior suggesting that people are making a shift towards the positive end of pre-contemplation, contemplation, preparation, and action in terms of stages of change with respect to substance abuse. Alcohol dependence, in terms of the percentage improved and recovered, is increased with a yoga intervention. This is a study comparing methadone with psychotherapy versus methadone with yoga, and the two were equivalent, suggesting yoga is equivalent to yoga therapy in helping change take place. This study looked at alcohol dependence, showing reductions with the yoga intervention over the course of a 6-month intervention. And this is yoga for smoking cessation. Beth Bach at Brown University now has significant funding to look at yoga as an intervention for smoking. And this is an outcome measure for a 7-day or 24-hour quit. And they compared yoga versus wellness and showed that the yoga, at least on the short term, was highly outperforming the wellness intervention. Just a final note, that some of these programs, there are programs of yoga for substance abuse in the U.S. This is a program that's involved with the style of yoga I practice called the Super Health Program. And we did a brief study with 10 addicts in northern India and published that in a paper some time ago and showed through a questionnaire that a lot of the risk factors and symptoms associated with substance abuse were substantially improving over time. This is a small single group trial, and we need larger randomized control trials. And then finally, I want to end with this study, which is preventive medicine. We were funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse to look at risk factors for substance abuse in middle school students. And this was done as a randomized controlled trial, sample size of 116 with 93 controls who continued their physical education practice. This was 32 sessions. This is the model for this. We ended up with 110 and 91, so a pretty good sample size. This was done with a Kripalu training program that was specific and targeted for adolescents. And what we found was basically out of 20 outcome measures, only one showed improvement. So we're trying to go back and fine-tune our work on this. But what this one outcome measure was willingness to smoke cigarettes. And the control group actually got worse, whereas the yoga group was able to hold their own. So we're looking at this as prevention, because this age group is when substance abuse is initiated. So if we can reduce the risk factors for initiation, we can prevent initiation of substance abuse and keep them from getting into this area. And our previous studies looking at other psychological factors have shown the same kind of pattern. The control subjects, the kids that don't get it, are deteriorating. And in fact, our adolescents have high burden of psychological health problems. So we're actually seeing that manifest. And what the yoga is doing is that it's keeping them on an even keel. It's preventing this decline in mental health. So I want to acknowledge the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health, which is a branch of our NIH that funds integrative medicine, including yoga and mind-body practices. Also the National Institute on Drug Abuse, which funded that study in the schools for prevention. The Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health, which is the largest yoga center in the United States, which is also funding yoga research, and they supported the research I was doing in yoga in the schools. And then finally, the Kundalini Research Institute, which provides me with some degree of support in the work I'm doing to promote research on yoga. So thanks very much for your attention.